In the autumn of 1857, a letter arrived at the offices of the Charleston Mercury newspaper, written in a careful hand that betrayed years of secretive practice. The sender identified herself only as Ems Washington, claiming to possess knowledge of events that had transpired on a plantation in the remote corners of Beaufort County, South Carolina. The editor, William Morrison, initially dismissed the correspondence as another abolitionist fabrication, but certain details mentioned in the letter, specific geographical markers, family names, and dates, compelled him to investigate further. The plantation in question, known as Greystone Manor, sat on approximately 2,000 acres of rice fields along the Combahee River, some 30 miles southwest of Charleston. Property records from the Beaufort County Courthouse show that the estate had belonged to the Harrington family since 1792, when Cornelius Harrington purchased the land with profits from his shipping business. By the 1850s, the plantation was under the management of his grandson, Edmund Harrington, a man described in local society pages as reclusive and methodical in his business dealings. What made Ems Washington's letter particularly unsettling was her claim that she had been born on the plantation in 1835 and had remained there until her escape in 1856. According to her account, she had witnessed events during her final year at Greystone that defied explanation and had haunted her during the months following her departure. The letter mentioned specific locations on the property: a root cellar beneath the main house, a series of quarters built unusually far from the working fields, and what she described as the silent house, positioned at the edge of the cypress swamp. Morrison's investigation began with a review of county records. The 1850 census listed Edmund Harrington as the owner of 63 enslaved individuals, a number that seemed modest for a plantation of Greystone's size. More puzzling were the ages listed for many of the enslaved population, an unusually high number of individuals recorded as being over 50 years of age. With very few children under 15, this demographic distribution differed markedly from neighboring plantations, where younger populations typically predominated due to natural increase and the economic advantages of raising children to working age. Church records from St. Helena's Parish provided additional anomalies. While most plantation owners in the region maintained careful records of births, deaths, and baptisms among their enslaved population, both for inventory purposes and religious obligations, the Harrington entries showed significant gaps. Between 1850 and 1856, only 3 births were recorded for Greystone Manor, despite the size of the population. Death records were similarly sparse, listing just 2 deaths during the same period. These numbers suggested either remarkable health conditions or significant underreporting. Local residents, when questioned discreetly, offered little information about the Harrington plantation. The family attended St. Helena's irregularly, and Edmund Harrington was rarely seen in Charleston social circles, despite his family's long-standing prominence. Merchants who conducted business with the plantation described their transactions as brief and formal. Rice shipments from Greystone arrived at Charleston docks on schedule, but the quantities seemed inconsistent with the plantation's apparent capacity. The physical description of Greystone Manor, as provided in Ems Washington's letter, matched surveyors' maps from 1843. The main house, built in the Georgian style common to successful planters, sat on a rise overlooking the river. An avenue of live oaks, planted by the original owner, extended from the main road to the house entrance. The enslaved quarters, however, were positioned differently from typical plantation layouts. Rather than forming a single community near the main house, they were distributed across 3 separate locations, with one group situated nearly a mile from the central buildings, close to the swamp's edge. M. Washington's letter described her final months at Greystone with precise detail that suggested genuine familiarity with the property. She mentioned the sound of the rice mill wheel, which operated only during specific tidal conditions. She referenced the pattern of work bells, 5 strikes at dawn, 3 at midday, 4 at evening, a system that corresponded to no standard plantation schedule documented in agricultural guides of the period. Most significantly, she described the basement of the main house, accessible through a door hidden behind a false wall in the kitchen pantry, a feature that would have been known only to those with intimate access to the building's interior. The events that M.C. Washington claimed to have witnessed began, according to her account, in late 1855. She described the arrival of a group of individuals who were housed in the remote quarters near the swamp. These newcomers, she wrote, were never seen working in the rice fields or participating in the usual activities of plantation life. Their quarters were visited regularly by Edmund Harrington himself, an unusual practice, as most plantation owners delegated such supervision to overseers or trusted enslaved individuals. What disturbed Monsieur Washington most profoundly was the silence that surrounded these new arrivals. In her letter, she described the typical sounds of plantation life, conversations carried on evening breezes, children's voices, songs that accompanied various forms of work. The quarters near the swamp, she wrote, remained consistently quiet, even during hours when some activity would be expected. When she attempted to approach this area during her regular duties, she found her path blocked by other enslaved individuals who redirected her away without explanation. The silent house that M. Washington mentioned in her letter appeared to be a structure separate from both the main house and the enslaved quarters. Her description placed it at the intersection of 2 paths, one leading to the swamp and another toward an abandoned section of rice fields. She wrote that the building appeared to be maintained despite its isolation, with evidence of regular cleaning and repair. Windows remained covered with heavy cloth, and the single door was consistently locked. She never observed anyone entering or leaving the structure during daylight hours. During the winter of 1855 to 1856, Monsieur Washington reported changes in the plantation's routine. Edmund Harrington began making more frequent visits to Charleston, sometimes remaining in the city for several days. During his absences, the plantation fell under the supervision of Thomas Mills, an overseer who had worked at Greystone for over a decade. Mills, according to Monsieur Washington's account, seemed uncomfortable with his temporary authority and restricted movement around the property more severely than usual. The most significant incident described in Nem. Washington's letter occurred during a February night in 1856. She reported being awakened by sounds that seemed to come from beneath the main house, what she described as voices speaking in urgent, whispered tones. Her quarters were located in the main cluster of buildings, close enough to the main house that sounds from the basement level might carry, particularly on still nights when normal daytime noises had ceased. Monsieur Washington wrote that she crept from her quarters and approached the main house, moving carefully to avoid detection. The sounds, she claimed, were coming from the hidden basement room she had observed during her duties in the main house. Through a small window at ground level, partially concealed by foundation plantings, she claimed to have seen lamplight and moving figures. The voices, though muffled by stone walls and wooden floors, seemed to involve multiple individuals engaged in what sounded like instruction or recitation. What she reported seeing through that window would later form the most disturbing portion of her testimony. Washington claimed to have observed approximately 8 to 10 individuals seated in a circle within the basement room. The participants appeared to include both Edmund Harrington and several individuals she did not recognize, men and women whose clothing suggested they were not residents of the plantation. In the center of the circle, she wrote, lay what appeared to be documents or books, though she could not discern their specific content from her limited vantage point. The gathering, according to Monsieur Washington's account, continued for several hours. Participants took turns speaking, though their words were too muffled for her to understand. At various points, individuals would stand and move to different positions within the room, suggesting some form of structured activity or ritual. The session concluded near dawn, with participants extinguishing lamps and departing through what Monsieur Washington assumed was an interior entrance to the basement, as she observed no one leaving the main house through exterior doors. Following this incident, Monsieur Washington reported additional changes in the plantation's atmosphere. The individuals housed in the remote quarters near the swamp began to disappear, not all at once, but gradually over the course of several weeks. She noticed their absence when meal distributions, which she helped prepare, required fewer portions. When she inquired about the missing individuals, other enslaved people responded with silence or redirection to other topics. The final event that M. Washington described in her letter occurred in early spring of 1856. She reported discovering, in a section of the rice fields that had been left fallow, what appeared to be recently disturbed soil. The area, approximately 20 feet square, showed evidence of digging and refilling, though no crops had been planted there. The soil's texture and color differed from the surrounding field, suggesting that earth had been removed and replaced. Nearby, she found several items that seemed out of place: fragments of cloth, a metal button, and what she described as hair that had been cut, not torn. These discoveries prompted Monsieur Washington's decision to escape from Greystone Manor. Her letter described a carefully planned departure that took advantage of her familiarity with local waterways and her connections with enslaved individuals on neighboring plantations. She wrote that her escape route followed paths through the cypress swamp, eventually reaching the Combahee River, where she secured passage on a vessel bound for Charleston. M. Washington's letter concluded with her assertion that the events at Greystone Manor represented something far more disturbing than typical plantation cruelties. She claimed that Edmund Harrington and his associates were engaged in activities that went beyond economic exploitation, involving what she termed experiments upon human souls. Her description suggested practices that combined medical experimentation with psychological manipulation, conducted upon individuals who had been specifically selected for their isolation from normal plantation community life. The investigation launched by William Morrison faced immediate obstacles. Edmund Harrington refused to respond to written inquiries and declined to meet with representatives from the Charleston Mercury. Attempts to visit Greystone Manor were met with denial of access, with plantation personnel claiming that Edmund Harrington was traveling and had left instructions that no visitors were to be admitted. Legal challenges to this restriction proved unsuccessful, as South Carolina law provided plantation owners with broad authority to control access to their property. Morrison's efforts to locate M. Washington herself proved equally frustrating. The letter had been delivered to the newspaper office by a third party, and no return address had been provided. Inquiries among Charleston's free black community and among enslaved individuals who had recently arrived in the city yielded no information about her whereabouts. It appeared that Monsieur Washington had either continued her journey to destinations outside South Carolina or had chosen to remain hidden within the city's large population. Independent verification of the plantation's population proved challenging due to the limitations of available records. The 1860 census, conducted several years after Monsieur Washington's reported escape, listed Edmund Harrington as the owner of 59 enslaved individuals, 4 fewer than the previous count. While this decrease could be explained by various factors, deaths, sales, or escapes, the demographic profile remained unusual, with an even higher proportion of older individuals and very few children. Local medical records provided no evidence of unusual mortality rates in Beaufort County during the period in question. Dr. Samuel Hughes, who served several plantations in the region, reported no epidemics or unusual health conditions that might explain the demographic patterns at Greystone Manor. His records did note that Edmund Harrington had never requested medical services for his enslaved population, claiming to handle such matters privately, a practice that, while not illegal, was considered unusual among planters of his social standing. The investigation took an unexpected turn in the summer of 1857, when Morrison received a second letter, this one from a different source. The writer identified himself as James Crawford, claiming to be a former overseer who had worked at Greystone Manor during 1854 and 1855. Crawford's letter corroborated several elements of Monsieur Washington's account, particularly regarding the unusual layout of the plantation and the presence of individuals housed separately from the main enslaved population. Crawford's testimony provided additional details about Edmund Harrington's management style and the plantation's operations. He described Harrington as intensely secretive about certain aspects of the property, maintaining personal control over areas that would typically fall under an overseer's supervision. The remote quarters near the swamp, Crawford wrote, were explicitly off-limits to him, with Harrington claiming that these individuals required special supervision due to unspecified health conditions. According to Crawford's account, his employment at Greystone Manor ended abruptly in late 1855, when he questioned Harrington about irregularities in supply orders. Crawford had noticed requests for materials that seemed inconsistent with normal plantation operations, medical instruments, chemicals typically used in preservation processes, and quantities of lime that exceeded what would be needed for agricultural purposes. When Crawford raised these concerns, Harrington dismissed him immediately and escorted him from the property personally. Crawford's letter also mentioned the basement room beneath the main house, describing it as Edmund Harrington's private study and laboratory. Crawford claimed to have observed scientific instruments and books on medical subjects during his limited visits to the main house. He described Harrington as remarkably well-educated for a planter, with particular interests in anatomy and what Crawford termed the workings of the human mind. The convergence of these two accounts prompted Morrison to expand his investigation beyond Greystone Manor itself. Research into Edmund Harrington's background revealed an unusual educational history. Unlike most planters' sons, who typically attended South Carolina College or similar institutions focused on classical education and agricultural management, Harrington had spent several years in Philadelphia studying at medical schools and reportedly working with physicians who specialized in mental ailments. Records from Philadelphia's medical community showed that Edmund Harrington had attended lectures at Jefferson Medical College during 1848 and 1849. His areas of study included anatomy, physiology, and what was then termed alienism, the treatment of mental disorders. Several professors recalled him as an intelligent but obsessive student who showed particular interest in experimental approaches to understanding human behavior and consciousness. Dr. Richard Whitman, who had instructed Harrington in anatomical studies, described him in a letter to Morrison as brilliant but disturbed in his applications of medical knowledge. Whitman noted that Harrington had proposed research projects that the medical faculty considered ethically questionable, involving experiments on human subjects that would not be acceptable under any circumstances. When his proposals were rejected, Harrington left Philadelphia abruptly, without completing his medical degree. This educational background provided a potential explanation for the activities described in the letters from M. Washington and James Crawford. Edmund Harrington's medical training, combined with his isolated plantation setting and access to enslaved individuals who could be subjected to experimentation without legal protection, created conditions for the type of systematic abuse that both correspondents had described. Morrison's investigation also revealed financial irregularities in Harrington's business dealings. Bank records showed periodic large expenditures that could not be explained by normal plantation operations. Payments to Philadelphia suppliers included orders for medical equipment, chemical compounds, and books on anatomy and mental medicine. These purchases continued regularly throughout the 1850s, suggesting ongoing experimental activities rather than casual intellectual interest. The most disturbing discovery in Morrison's investigation came through court records in Charleston. In 1854, Edmund Harrington had petitioned the court for permission to establish what he described as a private medical facility for the treatment of mental ailments among the enslaved population. The petition claimed that such a facility would serve a humanitarian purpose by providing care for individuals whose conditions made them unsuitable for normal plantation labor. The court had approved Harrington's petition, granting him authority to operate such a facility on his plantation property. The approval was granted with minimal oversight requirements, reflecting the legal system's general assumption that plantation owners were best positioned to manage their own property and population. This legal authorization provided Harrington with broad latitude to conduct activities that might otherwise attract legal scrutiny. The timing of this court petition corresponded closely with Monsieur Washington's account of changes at Greystone Manor. Her letter described the arrival of individuals who were housed separately and treated differently from the general enslaved population, beginning in approximately 1855. The court records suggested that these individuals may have been specifically selected for Harrington's experimental medical program. Further investigation revealed that Edmund Harrington had connections with other individuals who shared his interests in experimental medicine. Correspondence recovered from a Philadelphia medical supply company showed regular communication between Harrington and Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician who had been expelled from Jefferson Medical College for conducting unauthorized experiments on patients at Philadelphia General Hospital. Webb's dismissal had resulted from discoveries that he had been performing surgical procedures on indigent patients without their knowledge or consent, ostensibly to test new medical theories. Letters between Harrington and Webb, obtained through the medical supply company's records, discussed what they termed opportunities for advancing medical knowledge through systematic observation of human subjects under controlled conditions. The correspondence made specific reference to Greystone Manor as an ideal location for such work, given its isolation and Harrington's legal authority over his enslaved population. These letters also referenced visits that Webb made to Greystone Manor during 1855 and 1856, timing that coincided with Monsieur Washington's account of strangers participating in gatherings in the basement of the main house. Webb's presence at the plantation would explain the involvement of individuals with medical training in whatever activities were being conducted there. The investigation reached a critical juncture in the autumn of 1857 when Morrison received information about the current status of Greystone Manor. A contact within the Beaufort County Courthouse reported that Edmund Harrington had filed papers to sell the plantation and relocate to Louisiana. The sale was being handled with unusual haste, and Harrington had reportedly already departed South Carolina, leaving the property under the management of a Charleston law firm. Morrison's attempt to visit the abandoned plantation finally succeeded in October 1857. Accompanied by a photographer and a physician, he was able to gain access to Greystone Manor through the cooperation of the legal firm handling the sale. What they discovered provided physical evidence that corroborated many of the claims made in the letters from Monsieur Washington and James Crawford. The basement room beneath the main house was exactly as described, a large, windowless space accessible through a concealed door behind the kitchen pantry. The room contained remnants of scientific equipment, including surgical instruments, chemical apparatus, and what appeared to be restraining devices designed for human subjects. Tables along the walls showed evidence of regular use, with stains that the accompanying physician identified as likely biological in origin. Books and papers left in the basement revealed the scope of Harrington's interests and activities. Medical texts focused on anatomy, surgery, and mental medicine were mixed with handwritten journals documenting what appeared to be systematic experiments. The journals contained detailed observations of human subjects, identified only by numbers, describing their responses to various treatments and procedures. One journal entry, dated February 18, 1956, described an experiment involving subject number 17 and documented the individual's responses to what was termed progressive psychological pressure. The entry noted the subject's initial resistance, followed by gradual compliance, and concluded with observations about the permanence of behavioral changes induced through the experimental protocol. Another journal contained anatomical drawings that suggested direct observation of human dissection. The precision of these illustrations indicated that they were based on actual procedures rather than theoretical study. Accompanying notes discussed the relationship between physical brain structure and mental function, with specific attention to areas of the brain that controlled memory and emotional response. The remote quarters near the cypress swamp provided additional evidence of the plantation's unusual activities. The buildings, though abandoned, showed modifications that differed significantly from typical enslaved housing. Windows had been covered with heavy boards, and interior walls contained soundproofing materials. Several rooms contained metal rings anchored to walls and floors, apparently designed to secure individuals in specific positions. Most disturbing were the discoveries made in the area that M. Washington had described as containing disturbed soil. Careful excavation revealed a series of shallow graves containing human remains. The bodies showed evidence of medical procedures, surgical incisions, missing organs, and bone modifications that suggested systematic experimentation. The number of graves corresponded roughly to the number of individuals that M. Washington claimed had disappeared from the remote quarters. Forensic examination of these remains, conducted by Dr. Charles Hammond of Charleston, revealed evidence of procedures that went far beyond any legitimate medical treatment. Several skulls showed holes that had been drilled with surgical precision, suggesting trepanation or other forms of brain surgery. Bones displayed cut marks consistent with dissection, and the arrangement of remains suggested that bodies had been systematically dismembered for anatomical study. Dr. Hammond's report concluded that the individuals buried in these graves had been subjected to medical experimentation of the most brutal and systematic nature. The precision of the procedures indicated that they had been conducted by individuals with significant medical training, corroborating the evidence of Edmund Harrington's educational background and his collaboration with Dr. Marcus Webb. The investigation's findings were published in the Charleston Mercury in November 1857, causing considerable public reaction throughout South Carolina and beyond. The detailed documentation of systematic medical experimentation on enslaved individuals represented one of the most thoroughly documented cases of such abuse in the antebellum South. The story was republished by newspapers throughout the northern states and provided powerful ammunition for abolitionist arguments about the inherent corruption of the slavery system. However, the legal response to these revelations was limited by the constraints of South Carolina law and the broader legal framework governing slavery. Edmund Harrington had already left the state, and efforts to locate him in Louisiana proved unsuccessful. The legal authority he had been granted to operate a medical facility on his plantation provided some protection against criminal charges, as his activities could be argued to fall within the broad discretion granted to plantation owners in managing their enslaved population. Dr. Marcus Webb's involvement in the Greystone Manor experiments led to his exclusion from medical societies in Philadelphia. But criminal prosecution proved impossible due to jurisdictional issues and the legal status of the victims. The medical establishment's response was limited to professional censure, reflecting the broader society's failure to provide legal protection for enslaved individuals against medical abuse. The fate of Monsieur Washington, whose letter had initiated the investigation, remained unknown. Despite extensive efforts by Morrison and others to locate her, no trace of her whereabouts was ever discovered. Some evidence suggested that she may have continued north to Canada, joining the thousands of escaped enslaved individuals who sought safety beyond the reach of American fugitive slave laws. Other accounts placed her in Philadelphia, working with abolitionist organizations to document similar cases of systematic abuse. James Crawford, the former overseer whose testimony had corroborated Monsieur Washington's account, disappeared shortly after his letter was published in the Charleston Mercury. His landlord in Charleston reported that Crawford had left his room suddenly, taking only essential belongings and leaving no forwarding address. Whether his disappearance was voluntary or the result of threats from individuals seeking to suppress the investigation was never determined. The physical evidence recovered from Greystone Manor was preserved by the Charleston Medical Society, which recognized the historical significance of the documentation despite the horrific circumstances of its creation. The journals and anatomical drawings provided rare insight into the methods used by individuals who exploited the vulnerability of enslaved people for experimental purposes. This documentation later proved valuable to historians studying the intersection of medicine, slavery, and systematic abuse in the antebellum South. The Greystone Manor case also revealed the broader network of individuals who were engaged in similar activities throughout the South. Correspondence found in Edmund Harrington's papers referenced other plantation owners and physicians who were conducting what they termed research into human nature using enslaved subjects. These networks operated with relative impunity, protected by the legal framework of slavery and the geographic isolation of plantation communities. The investigation's impact extended beyond immediate public reaction to influence broader discussions about medical ethics and human experimentation. The systematic documentation of abuse at Greystone Manor provided concrete evidence of the potential for medical knowledge to be perverted into instruments of torture and control. This evidence contributed to developing standards for medical research that would eventually require informed consent and ethical oversight. For the enslaved community throughout South Carolina, the revelations about Greystone Manor confirmed fears about the vulnerability of individuals who could be subjected to any form of abuse without legal recourse. The case became part of the oral history transmitted within enslaved communities, serving as a warning about the potential dangers of isolation from community support networks. The broader historical significance of the Greystone Manor case lies in its documentation of the extreme forms that systematic dehumanization could take within the slavery system. The combination of legal authority, medical knowledge, and racial ideology created conditions that allowed Edmund Harrington and his associates to pursue their experimental interests without meaningful constraint. The case illustrated how the fundamental denial of human rights inherent in slavery could enable forms of abuse that went far beyond economic exploitation. Research conducted decades later, would reveal that the Greystone Manor case was not unique. Similar instances of medical experimentation on enslaved individuals occurred throughout the antebellum South, though few were as thoroughly documented as Edmund Harrington's activities. The legal framework that permitted such experimentation persisted well beyond the end of slavery, contributing to ongoing patterns of medical abuse directed at vulnerable populations. The story of Greystone Manor also demonstrates the crucial role that testimony from enslaved individuals played in exposing systematic abuse. Washington's courage in documenting her experiences, despite the enormous risks involved, provided the foundation for revealing crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden. Her letter represents one of the few surviving first-hand accounts of medical experimentation from the perspective of its victims. The investigation launched by William Morrison illustrated both the potential for journalism to expose systematic abuse and the limitations imposed by legal and social structures that protected perpetrators. Despite the thoroughness of Morrison's documentation and the compelling nature of the evidence he assembled, the legal system's response remained constrained by its fundamental acceptance of enslaved people's lack of legal protection. The final disposition of the Greystone Manor property reflected the broader society's desire to move past the revelations rather than confront their implications fully. The plantation was eventually sold to a buyer from Georgia, who demolished the main house and converted the land to different agricultural uses. The graves discovered during the investigation were quietly reinterred in an unmarked section of a local church cemetery, and the physical evidence of the experiments was removed from public view. By 1860, the Greystone Manor case had largely faded from public attention, overtaken by the mounting political crisis that would lead to civil war. The issues raised by the investigation, questions about medical ethics, human experimentation, and the systematic abuse of vulnerable populations, would not receive sustained attention until much later in American history. The documentation preserved from Greystone Manor remained in the archives of the Charleston Medical Society until the facility was damaged during the Civil War. Most of the papers were lost, though some fragments survived and were eventually transferred to the South Carolina Historical Society. These remaining documents continue to provide evidence of one of the most thoroughly documented cases of systematic medical abuse in American history. The legacy of Washington's courage in exposing the crimes at Greystone Manor extends beyond the immediate impact of her testimony. Her willingness to document systematic abuse, despite the enormous personal risks involved, established a precedent for survivors of medical experimentation who would later come forward with their own accounts. The letter that initiated the investigation stands as a testament to the power of individual testimony to challenge institutional abuse and demand accountability. The broader historical context of the Greystone Manor case illustrates how the systematic denial of human rights creates conditions that enable extreme forms of abuse. The legal framework of slavery, combined with the isolation of plantation communities and the emerging field of experimental medicine, provided Edmund Harrington with unprecedented opportunities to exploit human subjects for his research interests. The case demonstrates how quickly medical knowledge can be perverted into instruments of torture when ethical constraints are absent and victims lack legal protection. The investigation conducted by William Morrison also revealed the limitations of contemporary institutions in responding to systematic abuse. Despite the compelling evidence assembled through his research, the legal and medical establishments proved unable or unwilling to pursue meaningful accountability for the crimes committed at Greystone Manor. This failure reflected broader patterns of institutional complicity in maintaining systems that enabled systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. The story of Greystone Manor concludes without resolution for its victims or meaningful accountability for its perpetrators. Edmund Harrington disappeared into the anonymity of the expanding American frontier, carrying his medical knowledge and experimental methods to new locations where similar opportunities for abuse might present themselves. The individuals who suffered under his experimental protocols were denied justice, their experiences documented only in the clinical observations recorded in Harrington's journals. M. Washington's fate remains unknown, though her impact on exposing systematic abuse cannot be measured solely by the immediate response to her testimony. Her detailed documentation of the crimes at Greystone Manor preserved evidence that would otherwise have been lost, contributing to historical understanding of the extreme forms that medical abuse could take within the slavery system. The courage she demonstrated in coming forward with her account, despite the enormous risks involved, established an example for other survivors of systematic abuse. The cypress swamps around the former location of Greystone Manor continue to hold their secrets, marked only by the occasional foundation stones and the unmarked graves of those who died under Edmund Harrington's experimental protocols. The silence that Monsieur Washington described as characteristic of the plantation's final years has returned, broken only by the natural sounds of wind through Spanish moss and water moving slowly through ancient channels toward the sea. Yet the echoes of what transpired at Greystone Manor continue to resonate through American history, preserved in the fragments of documentation that survived and the testimony of those who witnessed systematic abuse and found the courage to speak. The case stands as a reminder of how quickly medical knowledge can become an instrument of oppression when ethical constraints are absent and victims lack legal protection, and of the crucial importance of listening to those who risk everything to expose institutional abuse. The most disturbing aspect of the Greystone Manor case may not be the specific cruelties that were documented, but rather the systematic nature of the abuse and the ease with which it was enabled by existing legal and social structures. The case illustrates how the fundamental denial of human rights creates conditions that make extreme abuse not only possible but likely, and how institutions that should provide protection can instead become complicit in maintaining systems of oppression. Today, the location where Greystone Manor once stood is marked only by a historical society sign that makes no mention of Edmund Harrington's experimental activities or the individuals who suffered under his protocols. The official narrative speaks of rice cultivation and antebellum architecture, maintaining the silence that M. Washington risked her life to break more than 150 years ago. But for those who know the full story, the landscape itself serves as a memorial to the victims whose names were replaced by numbers in Edmund Harrington's journals, whose bodies were subjected to systematic experimentation, and whose experiences were documented only as clinical observations in the service of perverted medical research. Their stories survive in the testimony of Monsieur Washington and the investigation conducted by William Morrison, preserved against the forces of historical amnesia that would prefer to forget the extreme forms that systematic dehumanization can take. The true legacy of the Greystone Manor case lies not in the specific crimes that were documented, but in the demonstration of how individual courage can challenge institutional abuse and demand accountability even under the most dangerous circumstances. Monsieur Washington's letter stands as evidence that even within systems designed to deny human dignity and agency, individuals can find ways to resist and expose systematic abuse, creating records that preserve truth against attempts at historical revision. The sound that still echoes from the cypress swamps around Greystone Manor is not the silence that Edmund Harrington sought to maintain, but the voice of M. Washington breaking that silence to demand that the world bear witness to crimes committed in the name of medical knowledge. Her testimony continues to challenge us to recognize and resist the systematic abuse of vulnerable populations, and to ensure that the courage of those who speak out against institutional oppression is not forgotten by history. In the decades that followed the Civil War, sporadic reports emerged from Louisiana suggesting that Edmund Harrington had established a new medical practice in the remote parishes along the Mississippi River. These accounts, though never officially verified, described similar patterns of disappearances and unusual medical activities among the freedmen population. Local authorities showed little interest in investigating these reports, reflecting the broader society's reluctance to confront the systematic abuse that had characterized the slavery era. Dr. Marcus Webb's fate proved equally elusive. Philadelphia medical records indicate that he left the city shortly after the Greystone Manor investigation was published, reportedly traveling west to territories where medical licensing requirements were less stringent. His name appeared occasionally in frontier newspaper accounts describing unusual medical practices, but no formal investigation was ever conducted into his post-Greystone activities. The legal precedents established by the Greystone Manor case influenced medical ethics discussions for decades, though meaningful reforms were slow to develop. The case was cited in early efforts to establish standards for medical experimentation, particularly regarding the necessity of patient consent and the prohibition of procedures conducted solely for research purposes. However, these discussions remained largely academic until the 20th century brought renewed attention to medical ethics and human rights. James Crawford's disappearance remained unexplained until 1892, when a death certificate was discovered in New Orleans, listing an individual of that name who had died in a charity hospital. The certificate noted that the deceased had been suffering from what physicians described as nervous exhaustion, and had repeatedly spoken of witnessing events too disturbing to forget. Whether this was the same James Crawford who had worked at Greystone Manor was never conclusively determined. The Charleston Medical Society's archives, containing the preserved evidence from Greystone Manor, were accessed occasionally by researchers studying the history of medical abuse. These investigations, conducted primarily in the early 20th century, confirmed the systematic nature of Harrington's experiments and identified connections to similar cases throughout the antebellum South. The documentation proved crucial in establishing patterns of medical exploitation that extended far beyond individual plantation settings. Monsieur Washington's ultimate fate remained the investigation's greatest mystery. In 1903, a researcher studying Underground Railroad records claimed to have found evidence that a woman matching her description had reached Canada and lived under an assumed name until her death in 1898. According to these records, she had continued to document cases of systematic abuse throughout her life, contributing to the growing body of testimony from slavery survivors. The physical location of Greystone Manor underwent multiple transformations as successive owners attempted to distance the property from its disturbing history. The original foundations were eventually covered by new construction, and the cypress swamp was partially drained for agricultural development. Yet local residents continued to report unusual sounds and disturbances in the area, leading to persistent stories about the plantation's haunted legacy. Modern archaeological surveys of the former Greystone Manor site, conducted in the 1970s as part of a broader study of plantation archaeology, uncovered additional evidence of the systematic abuse that had occurred there. Soil analysis confirmed the presence of chemical compounds consistent with the preservation methods described in Harrington's journals, while ground-penetrating radar revealed structural anomalies suggesting additional burial sites beyond those discovered in the original investigation. The broader historical significance of the Greystone Manor case was finally recognized in 1987, when the site was designated as a place of historical significance by the South Carolina Historical Commission. The designation acknowledged the importance of preserving evidence of systematic medical abuse while honoring the courage of those who had exposed these crimes. A small memorial was erected bearing only the inscription, "In memory of those who suffered here, and in honor of those who spoke for them." Research conducted in the 21st century has placed the Greystone Manor case within the broader context of medical experimentation conducted on enslaved and other vulnerable populations throughout American history. These studies have identified similar patterns of abuse extending well into the 20th century, demonstrating how the dehumanization documented at Greystone Manor established precedents for ongoing systematic exploitation. The testimony of Monsieur Washington stands as one of the most detailed first-person accounts of medical experimentation from the slavery era. Her precise documentation of events, her careful attention to physical details, and her courage in coming forward despite enormous personal risk created a historical record that continues to inform our understanding of systematic abuse and resistance. Her letter represents not only evidence of specific crimes, but also a testament to the power of individual testimony to challenge institutional oppression. The investigation conducted by William Morrison demonstrated both the potential for journalism to expose systematic abuse and the importance of preserving evidence against attempts at historical revision. His methodical approach to documenting the crimes at Greystone Manor, combined with his persistence in pursuing the investigation despite legal and social obstacles, created a record that survived subsequent attempts to suppress or minimize the significance of the case. The legacy of Greystone Manor extends beyond the specific crimes committed there to encompass broader questions about medical ethics, human rights, and the responsibility of institutions to protect vulnerable populations. The case illustrates how quickly medical knowledge can become an instrument of oppression when ethical constraints are absent, and how crucial it is to maintain vigilance against the systematic abuse of power. Today, the former site of Greystone Manor serves as a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge without ethical constraint can lead to the most extreme forms of human exploitation. The silence that once protected Edmund Harrington's experimental protocols has been permanently broken by the testimony of Monsieur Washington and the investigation that her courage made possible. The cypress swamps around Greystone Manor continue to grow, slowly reclaiming the land where systematic abuse once flourished under the protection of legal authority and social indifference. But the voices of those who suffered there, and of those who risked everything to expose their suffering, remain preserved in the historical record, challenging each generation to recognize and resist the forces that enable systematic dehumanization. The most enduring lesson of the Greystone Manor case may be that individual courage, even under the most dangerous circumstances, can break through institutional silence and demand accountability for systematic abuse. M. Washington's letter stands as proof that truth can survive attempts at suppression, and that the testimony of survivors can ultimately challenge even the most powerful systems of oppression. In the end, the story of Greystone Manor is not primarily about the specific horrors that occurred there, but about the human capacity for both extreme cruelty and extraordinary courage. The case reminds us that the protection of human dignity requires constant vigilance against those who would exploit vulnerability for personal gain, and that the voices of those who speak out against systematic abuse must be preserved and honored by history. The sound that echoes from Greystone Manor today is not the silence that Edmund Harrington sought to impose, but the enduring testimony of Monsieur Washington, and all those who refuse to let institutional abuse remain hidden in darkness. Their courage continues to illuminate the path toward justice and accountability, ensuring that the lessons learned from systematic abuse are not forgotten by successive generations.